Correct time already?
It's 5 o'clock and we have started the webinar.
Actually, my watch said still 1 minute to go. Right now we have 8, 6, 12 people. Yeah. Oh, shall we start now?
Yes, please.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, or if you are in Taiwan, probably good morning. Welcome to this public lecture on why do legislators brawl. Very much about lawmaking, all kinds of violence in terms of fist fighting, sometimes slapping or doing all kinds of hair pulling. Lots of activities to block or to disrupt. So we are very, very pleased to have our speaker for today, Professor Nathan Battle. But before that, I'm asked to introduce, because this is an event co-hosted by 21st Century China Center and the Center for Taiwan Studies. So I think in the background you can see a little bit about the School of Global Strategy, Policy and Strategy. This is a very, very important professional school in international affairs and public policy. And 21st Century China Center is a very important research center and think tank on what's going on in China in terms of politics, economy, society, international relations, environment, and history. All kinds of things related to contemporary China. And Taiwan's study center actually very much, we define ourselves as the bridge between Taiwan and Taiwanese America, US and Taiwan, all kinds of, in the way that we try to expand the scope of Taiwan studies. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Nathan Battle. I have the book here. Nathan is one of our alumni. He is Associate Research Fellow at the Institute of Political Science, Academia Sinica, and also at the Election Studies Center. The book, he's the co-author of the book, Making Punches Count. This is a very, very wonderful book on why all over the world, especially Taiwan, Ukraine, South Korea, Turkey, all over, having all kinds of legislatures are constantly punching each other. So today, Nathan is going to enlighten us about why in Taiwan, lots of these kinds of fist fight. And the idea is that he will give 30 minutes and I will be asking him 1 or 2 questions, and then the floor will be open for more discussion. So, Nathan.
All right. I'm really, really happy to be giving this lecture. It's a thrill for me to be back, even just virtually at UCSD, where I got my PhD many years ago. I would like to start by let's see if we can do this. Let's hide that. So I would like to thank everyone for coming, and I'd like to thank the School of Global Public Policy and Strategy, the GPS, and the Taiwan Studies Center, which are 2 institutions that didn't exist when I was at UCSD. I'm thrilled that they do now, and I'm elated to be here. I want to start this talk. It's about legislative brawls. So I want to start by giving you a little bit of flavor of legislative brawls around the world. And this is a news report from a Pakistani TV station that shows just a few instances of legislative brawls.
The history of losing their cool inside the parliament and we thought this would be a good opportunity to show you some. There's even a term for these political brawls. It's called legislative violence. We put together some of the most infamous instances of legislative violence.
So we'll start here in Turkey. There are lots of brawls in Turkey. Some of them are even justified. This is a South African brawl. They're nicely color coded so you can see which party is which party. Kosovo, they're using tear gas and paint and pepper spray. We never got that far in Taiwan. Here's Nepal. This is a South Asian news broadcast. So they're heavily staying in South Asia. Ukraine. Boxing is a big deal in Ukraine. Here's Japan, and you can see that this one looks a lot more like what we normally see in Taiwan, with masses of people fighting over a strategic location and a lot of pushing. And here is an Indian, this is Uttar Pradesh, which is the biggest state, the biggest subnational government in the world. Uttar Pradesh is much bigger than any Chinese province. There's about 200 million people. And they're really throwing stuff, and it's quite violent here. So let's stop here. Let's see if we can go on. So the point of that is that these legislative brawls, if you're not familiar with Taiwan, that's kind of what they look like around the world. Those were a little bit more violent than usual, but not too much. If you are from Taiwan, you've seen a lot of things like that. And the point here is that it's not just Taiwan. They do happen all over the world. The best study of this is a recent one by Morris Schmoll and Ongyang Ting, and they've documented 365 cases in 78 countries. And you can see from their map that they're all over the world. A lot of what we would think of as new democracies or troubled democracies, but not necessarily just those. You also have cases in established democracies like Japan or Italy. And it's hard to see on this map, but they even have one case here in France and one case in New Zealand. There are no cases in North Korea or China or Cuba. You have to have a little bit of democracy to have a legislative brawl. And of course, the four biggest cases are South Korea, Turkey, Ukraine, and Taiwan. I said 365 cases in about 30 years. That's definitely an underestimate. The real number is easily twice as high, probably 3 or 4 times as high. The highest number they have on this map is 38. That's Taiwan. In our research, we documented 202 cases in roughly the same time period. So there are cases of legislative brawls around the world that we need to figure out how to think about them because they're not that rare. And unfortunately, the legislative studies literature, the general political science literature offers almost nothing to explain what's going on. So Emily Beaulieu and I wrote a book trying to put some theoretical foundations underneath this phenomenon that happens around the world. And let me say a quick word about Emily. Emily is also a UCSD graduate. In fact, we were in the same cohort. And I like to think of Emily as a specialist in democracy and chaos. She's written about election boycotts, contentious ethnic politics, the gender differences between how people interpret corruption scandals, and of course now this legislative brawls. And so we had a great time writing this book. And if you're going to write something, I strongly recommend you find a brilliant UCSD political scientist to co-author with. Okay, so our book here is Making Punches Count: The Individual Logic of Legislative Brawls, and we are trying to figure out, why do individual legislators participate in brawls? Yeah. And a lot of people will say brawling is what happens when people lose control. It's a bunch of hot-headed people who've just kind of lost their minds and become children for a second. And we fundamentally reject that. We think that brawling is a strategic choice made by cold-headed, rational actors who are trying to get something. But let me start with the fundamental paradox of brawling, and that is that most voters hate it. Most voters will tell you that they strongly dislike seeing brawling, and in fact, our survey evidence says that they feel shame and disgust, and they have negative impressions of brawlers, and they look down on the parties that brawl, and they look down on the people who brawl. And so brawlers are trying to win at democracy by doing something unpopular, which is very strange because politicians usually do things that are popular to win at democracy, but brawlers are not. They are doing something unpopular in an effort to better their democratic careers. But so this is a fundamental paradox of brawling, and it's also the key to understanding it. Brawling imposes costs, reputational costs on brawlers, and that turns out to be incredibly important to understand what's going on. But because brawling is costly, one of the first questions people ask us is, if it helps your career, why don't people brawl all the time? And the answer is they don't. They usually don't brawl precisely because it's costly. Okay. We think that brawling is about political communication. When we draw on the international relations literature of signaling to suggest that legislators are using brawling to send a signal about themselves to a target audience, and that target audience might be quite small. And the key here is that the legislator believes that the target audience can help advance their political career. But that target audience needs to know something about them. They might have doubts about that legislator's goals and loyalties, and they need to be reassured. So the legislator sends a message about their own type to that target audience, so that that target audience will help them advance their political career. And the message is almost always, I will fight for you, some version of this. You is different. Who you means is different in different contexts, and I'll talk about that next. But the message is some version of, I will fight for you, you can trust me, I will do what you want. Well, everybody will say that. Talk is cheap. But because they are paying a cost to send this signal, it is much more credible. The cost of the signal makes it much more credible, which is a lesson from international relations. When everybody says, don't mess with me, don't mess with my country, we will penalize you, or we'll fight you, or we'll start a war. Well, talk is cheap, but if you back it up with something that is costly, it becomes much more credible. And in the same way, brawling, it makes the message that I will fight for you and you can trust me to do that much more credible. So most brawls happen in the context of partisan opposition. The majority wants to do something, the minority wants to stop them. The minority doesn't have the power to stop them, they don't have the votes, and so they disrupt. And in the context of this disruption, a legislator or several legislators will introduce violence or escalate violence in order to draw attention to themselves so that they can send that kind of message. And it's a little bit different according to the type of party system you have. In strong party systems, in which parties shape political careers, in which you don't change parties lightly or almost ever, where voters are attached to a particular party and can reliably vote on them, reliably vote for them year after year after year, and parties cultivate talent and run campaigns. In these strong party systems, it's a little different than in weak party systems. So the key questions are: who controls the nominations, who controls other critical resources, and who controls career advancement? Who in the party controls those? And do they need to know more about the individual legislators? And so the possible targets in these strong party systems include the party leaders, sometimes even just one party leader. Or the other possible target is strong party supporters in the electorate. And I wrote that in red because in the Taiwanese context, that's usually, in the contemporary Taiwanese politics, that's usually the target that they are looking to. And so the legislator sends the message, I will be a good party soldier. I will do things for the party. You can count on me. In weak party systems, so the parties don't shape political careers, individual legislators kind of have to take care of themselves. It's a little bit different. The key questions are the same. What resources do I need? Who has them? And who can provide them for me? And do those people need to know more about me? But the possible targets are different. Once again, party leaders can be a target. Even in weak party systems, the party leaders might have some resources that are useful. But more commonly, it's unaligned voting blocks. And the best example of this is actually from Ukraine, where the Brawlers legislators talked a lot about a group of voters that they called the radicals. And the radicals were voters that were kind of pro-European, anti-Russian, but mostly anti-corruption. They were not aligned with any particular party, so this time they would vote predominantly for one party. Next time they might vote predominantly for another party. They were a clear block of voters, but they weren't reliably aligned with any particular political party. And so brawlers would appeal to them, trying to send a signal that I'll fight for your interests. I'll fight for what you want. And then the last possible target are economic elites. In Ukraine, they have oligarchs, billionaires, who can fund your political career, and then you can try to turn that money into political power. And so the message here is, again, I will fight for you, but it's a little bit different. I'll be a good soldier for your party, maybe, for your cause, or even for your personal interests. But more or less, the message is always, I will fight for you. You might be a different you in different contexts. So the structure of our book, we wrote chapter 1 introduces the theory, the premise, the basic argument. Chapter 2 is a background chapter. We introduce politics in Taiwan and Ukraine, who are two feature cases, the political systems, the party systems, and then the history of brawling in those two countries. And then we look around the world at different brawls in different countries in the world. So we look at the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, South Africa, Uganda. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few others. Just a little bit to give you a taste of brawling around the world. Chapter 3 is an exhaustive, excruciatingly detailed look at our theory. And then the next 4 chapters are empirical, testing some of the implications of that theory. So chapter 4 looks at the type of people who brawl. And in the Taiwan context, we look at video evidence from the last 20 years and identify the types of legislators who are more likely to participate in brawls. Chapter 5 looks at the role that the media plays in transmitting the signal to target audiences. And so in Taiwan, we look at the United Daily News, and we find that when you compare legislators who brawl and legislators who don't brawl, the brawlers are about twice as likely to be mentioned in the United Daily News. And moreover, we look at the brawlers when they brawl and when they don't brawl. And when they brawl, they're about 4 times as likely to be mentioned. So brawlers are more likely to be mentioned in the media. And among the brawlers, they're much more likely to be mentioned when they brawl than when they don't brawl. Chapter 6 looks at the audience for brawling. And again, we look at different countries. In the Taiwan context, we do a really neat investigation of 2 special sessions in the legislature in 2017. If you remember, in 2017, there was one special session in which the contentious pension reform was passed, and there were no brawls. And then right after that, there was a special session in which there was a contentious infrastructure package that was passed, and there were constant brawls that got international coverage for being so salacious. And we interviewed the same set of respondents 3 times before both special sessions, in between them, and after them. And most people reacted very positively to the first special session, in which a contentious issue was resolved peacefully, and then they reacted negatively to the second special session in which a contentious issue was resolved with lots of brawls. And only one group, our theorized target audience, was different. The extreme supporters of the minority party reacted exactly the opposite way. They reacted negatively to the peaceful resolution of an issue, and they reacted positively to the violence. So that's really strong evidence for our theorized target audience. And then finally, we look at re-election, and do brawlers actually do better in getting reelected? And we have 30 some odd years of Taiwanese data. And the answer is, yeah, they do a little bit. It's not a huge effect, but brawlers get reelected about 10% more often than non-brawlers. And again, you wouldn't expect it would be an overwhelming effect because brawling is costly. Okay, rather than going through one of those chapters in any kind of detail, instead what I want to do here is look at a couple of actual brawls and talk through them. So this is a brawl from earlier this year in May, when the KMT and TPP majority, their coalition majority, tried to expand legislative powers, and the DPP was trying to stop that. And so one of the things that happens in these kind of, what they're doing is a podium occupation, the legislators can still pass things even in the middle of chaos, but the speaker has to be, the presiding officer, who's usually the speaker, has to be at the podium and getting each item through. So we have an item, we have a motion on the floor to stop discussion, and we're not going to hold a vote. There's a second for that. Okay, now we're going to open the voting, and then now we've closed the voting, and 57 people voted yes, and 43 people voted no. The motion passes, and they go through all this even while there's this chaos going on everywhere else. And so to defeat this, you have to get the presiding officer off that position. And we know how to do that. There are two ways to do that. You can either pull the people off the speaker's podium and then move the speaker off, or so as you pull them off individually, or you can use the collective weight of your bodies to push them off. So you do 1, 2, 3, push, 1, 2, 3, push. What you don't do is some kind of individual action, which is what happened in this case. So, sorry, I have to go through another ad here because I'm not good at YouTube. So you can see Sun Bo-young here is a DPP legislator. He's coming up over the top. The speaker is way over to the right. And it's pretty easy to deal with Sun Bo-young. He says, push him over the top, and they do. And they throw him over the side. And that was pretty easily dealt with. Okay. Here's another, this is another Cho Tzu-wei, also gets dealt with that way. He is not a threat. And then a third legislator, Guo Guowen, will come up and also try to disrupt and move the speaker off off his position and get nowhere. So here comes Guo Guowen running over towards the speaker. Oh, there's the speaker. So you can see here's the speaker. He hasn't been threatened at all. This was totally useless in terms of actually stopping the legislative process. But what did happen is that the first legislator who got thrown off the front became a symbol for the DPP opposition. So for the rest of the session, the rest of the day, and actually the next couple of days, the DPP kept screaming about majority violence. And while even Sun Bo-young's been sent to the hospital, here you can see he's being sent to the emergency room to deal with, to check whether he has a concussion or not. He's fine. Don't worry about him. So why did Sun Bo-young do that? Well, Sun Bo-young is not a very well-known legislator. If you know him, you know him because he has talked about Chinese information or disinformation and internet warfare. What you don't know him as is as a DPP stalwart. And so here he is. He was the first term legislator, not very well known in the party and not well known as a DPP fighter. And he's successfully drawing attention to himself, saying, look at me, I'm fighting for the DPP and its causes, and you can trust me to do that. And he drew a lot of attention to himself and raised his profile quite a bit. I think probably advanced his political career. If he wants to run for any other office, DPP supporters will have an image of him in their minds as somebody they can rely on to fight for DPP causes, not necessarily just his own causes. The second story I want to talk about goes way back in time. This is 1988. So the legislature is still full of people elected in China in 1946. And The DPP has just been legalized. Martial law has just been lifted, I think. So we're in the transition to democracy. And in this, the opposition uses brawling as a way to highlight the illegitimacy of the authoritarian regime. And usually when this happens, they will insult one of the senior legislators and say, you have no right to be speaking in the People's Hall. You don't have a democratic mandate, so shut up. And of course, the old senior legislators would react indignantly and say, I am a legitimate representative of the Republic of China, and it would descend into chaos. This is not exactly that script. This particular brawl is about the education budget. And the Constitution explicitly requires 15% of the national budget to go to education. So the DPP opposition is saying, look, 15% is not what's being spent on education. It never has been. You don't respect your own Constitution. The regime is illegitimate, and it shows it by ignoring its own, it's very, the Constitution that it claims to revere. In all these early brawls, the key figure is a legislator named Zhu Gaozhen. He was a young lawyer. He was a young philosopher. He got a PhD in philosophy from, I think, I forget which university in Germany, maybe Mannheim. But he is the key figure in almost all of these early brawls. And so we will look at this one. And so the KMT is saying it's time. The DPP wants to send this legislation, the budget, back to committee or back to the cabinet for reconsideration so they can spend 15% of the national budget on education. And the KMT is saying it's time to vote. Shut up. So let's move forward to about here.
新闻稿里面写得很清楚的，那还重封吗？所以主席你这样处理不起来，这样换人啊，你就根据这个程序就马上处理预算，是不是？交审查或者是退完行政院你就表决了，对不对
So he's saying it's time to vote.
朱高正委员跳上主席台，将78岁的刘副院长推倒，引起公愤。其他委员一拥而上，双方大打出手。
Okay, and that's about all that happens there. And you can see again, the protest is completely ineffectual. It doesn't stop anything. They vote on the bill and it passes right immediately afterwards. But that's not the point. The point here is political communication. Zhu Gaozhen is the key figure, as I said, in almost all of these early brawls. This is more like what we said, a weak party system. The DPP had just formed. It wasn't really a strong party yet. It didn't have strong control over its members. There were only 7 members of the caucus, and they were pretty much on their own. The voters didn't have real strong party loyalties. You couldn't depend on a DPP party vote. And in fact, Zhu Gaozhen didn't follow the DPP party ideals very closely. The DPP was developing a Taiwanese nationalist identity, and Zhu Gaozheng was a Chinese nationalist. And he had an uneasy relationship with the rest of the party, and in fact would leave the party very soon. But he was appealing to a group of voters in the electorate, to this pro-democratic, anti-authoritarian voters, rather than to strong party loyalists within the electorate. And he established a reputation as Taiwan's preeminent brawler. He was nicknamed Taiwan Di Zanjian, so Taiwan's #1 battleship. And the English media called him Taiwan's Rambo. But he did build a tie to this pro-democratic electorate. And his re-election in 1989, I consider to be the single most spectacular electoral result in Taiwanese history. He's won just a smashing victory in 1989 against all odds. And probably was one of the key elements in establishing the idea in Taiwan that brawlers do well in elections, because people always think that brawlers do really well, better than they actually do. But so this is another good example of a brawl in Taiwan. So to wrap it up here, brawling occurs in spite of, but also because of its unpopularity. The costliness of the signal is both a reason not to brawl, but also a reason that it works. Legislators believe that the rewards from the target audience will outweigh the costs from general audiences. And if you want to reform the system, any reform has got to change this calculation. And probably that would involve raising the costs from general audiences by highlighting the profile of brawlers during elections, but also it would involve elite audiences not rewarding brawling behavior quite as much. And then I want to end on the thought that brawling is not necessarily a death sentence to democracy. Taiwan's been brawling, it's chronic brawling for almost four decades. And yet it is one of the stars in the contemporary world of democracy. It is one of the outstanding cases. So brawling can be bad for democracy, but it can also be not so terrible. So I will stop here.
Well, we thank Nathan so much. This is a wonderful talk about brawling, and in terms of the paradoxical kinds of situation, it's very costly and sometimes even do harm to individuals. When they are brawling, they actually could get hurt and hurting others. And this is paradoxical way that they are presenting themselves as good soldiers for the party, targeting the audience, especially party supporters. So that mostly will be building up the symbolic capital. Next time, you will get reelected. So this is all very, very calculated in this kinds of way to talk about. This is not just certain kinds of violence, it's also act or show. It has certain kinds of performativity in some way. So we are not getting some questions, but I think I would like to ask you two questions. First, around gender, because in your presentation, you mostly just show male brawlers. Zhu Gaozhen, Shen Boyang, and all this. But in your book with Emily, you actually talked about lots of women slapping each other, pulling their hairs, and doing lots of these kinds of a little bit feminine to disrupt and to call on these kinds of questions about corruption, procedure issues, and also budget, especially education and environment. So this is also in relation to minority rights. They don't want a majority violence. So a lot of these kinds of issues. So my first question to you is, does gender play some kind of vital role in terms of targeting the audiences in a way that female brawler, especially right now, lots of media attention in Taiwan in all kinds of ways. And that would relate to my second question about age. So the first question is about gender. Do you see male and female brawlers having that kinds of different kinds of way to in their image and in the way that they project how they are going to be reelected, and in all kinds of ways try to produce certain kinds of impact? You want me to talk about the second question as well?
Either way.
Okay, the second question actually very much relate to age, because I think some of us think that only younger democracies tend to have these kinds of violence. If you are getting more and more mature and more able to, in all kinds of ways, institutionalized, you don't have these kinds of individual kinds of cases of brawling. And in your book with Emily, you talk about age group 40 to 49. They are more violent than others, tend to use brawl. And also, first term, but when they are reelected, they are less likely to resort to these kinds of brawling. So that would be my two questions to you, one on gender, one on age, and also in terms of what do you think that if the democratic system in Taiwan becoming more mature, age a little bit, and age gracefully, probably fewer brawlers. Do you think so?
Yeah, let me answer those questions in reverse order.
Yeah.
We did not study which countries are more likely to brawl and when, but there has been a little bit of research by one of our former collaborators, Christopher Gandrud, who found that brawls tend to decrease with age overall. But that's what happens when you use big data sets over lots and lots of years. Individual countries can brawl for quite a long time. So Taiwan's been brawling for 40 years. 40 years is quite a long time.
Yeah.
The United States had brawls for until the Civil War, so 80 years. And actually, there were brawls for almost 100 years in the United States. The most recent brawl I know of in the United Kingdom was 1933, which is quite a long time after it democratized. So individual countries will change at different rates. And we don't know why brawling fades away in some places, and it doesn't fade away in other places, or it's slower in other places. That's something that I hope other people will research.
Yeah, definitely.
As far as the age of individuals, yeah, younger legislators and less senior legislators, so first-term legislators, are more likely to get involved in brawls. And we think that that's because they don't have established political reputations in the ways that older legislators and more senior legislators tend to. The idea is You brawl because people aren't sure what kind of person you are. Once you get an established reputation, you no longer have the same need to communicate things about yourself. So one of the really interesting findings was about Zhu Gaozheng in particular. After his first term, he didn't brawl very much. He established a reputation in 1987, 88, 89 as a constant brawler, somebody who would fight for democracy and fight against the authoritarian regime. After 1990, he's almost never involved in brawls. He didn't need to. People knew about him. And you find that again and again and again. It's not the case that older people never brawl and more senior people never brawl, but they do brawl a lot less. On gender, we spent a lot of time trying to tease out some of the gender effects, and there's still a lot more to understand. It's incredibly complex. One of the things we found is that in Taiwan, just looking at video evidence, women are not less likely to get involved in brawls. People think that this is a male-dominated activity. In Taiwan, it's not. Women are just as likely to be involved, and maybe even just a little bit more. One of the reasons for this is that the gender stereotypes that most people hold think of fighting as a masculine type of activity. And so brawling goes against standard gender stereotypes, which means that women potentially face a larger backlash for violating those standard gender stereotypes. That could mean that brawling is more costly to women, but again, more costly could mean that their signal is more credible. So for women, brawling might be a high risk, high reward activity compared to men. We haven't really sorted this out completely. I'm going to do more research on gender effects and how men and women experience brawling differently. But this is a fascinating topic. So I don't have really good answers for that. But there is more research to be done.
Yes, thank you so much. I think the floor is open. We have about 5 people raising questions. The first one actually talks about how long that would last in terms of US and all kinds of democracies in the world having these kinds of brawling.
So there is no answer, no specific answer to how long it will last. In the United States, brawling was very common for the first 80 years. The most recent brawl I know of in the United States was 1962, in which 2 Texans, Henry Gonzalez and Ed Foreman, punched each other on the floor of the U.S. House because Ed Foreman called Henry Gonzalez a pinko commie, and Henry Gonzalez hit him back. That's 1962. That's not just after the establishment of democracy in the United States. That's quite a while. There are other cases in which brawling slows down. So we talk a lot about South Korea, and they had a reform in 2012 that cut back brawling quite a lot, not completely though. So reforms can help, but they might not completely stop it. But I don't have a definitive answer for how long brawling will persist. In Taiwan, there doesn't seem to be an end in clear sight. The politicians don't seem to be motivated to resolve this problem. it doesn't seem to be that much of a perceived problem for most politicians. And there are other things that they want to do first.
Thank you. I think in relation to that, we have, I think the first three actually anonymous in a way that I think probably I can summarize for them. I think the second question also very much in relation to age. You partially already answered that. The person said long established democracies in Western Europe and US, they don't really have that many brawling cases. So the question very much around if when you becoming more experienced and younger democracies probably more likely to have these kinds of brawling, but if once more institutionalized and you have all kinds of regulations and people actually more recognizing the risk of brawling, having all kinds of way to, as you said about South Korea, having all kinds of reform, all kinds of way to tame or try to restrain brawling in the way that they set up all kinds of in-chamber rules or how to preserve all kinds of minority rights. That probably, so the second question very much around these kinds of issue. Any follow-up on this?
I think that's mostly right. Again, our study wasn't really about when countries brawl and how to mitigate brawling. It was really about individual legislators and when they choose to get involved. But it does seem to be a question of minority rights. Not all brawls are partisan opposition. I ignored, for purposes of time, I ignored the brawls that involve personal insults, which we call honor brawls, which are, 20% of cases worldwide. But I would be cautious in thinking that you can just pass rules and laws about brawling. This is fundamentally a political process, and it has to be dealt with through political logic. If it makes sense politically to brawl, if you get positive payoffs, you're going to do it no matter what the rules of the chamber say is permissible or not permissible. So it has to be penalized by the voters more than it is rewarded by your target audience. And that's fundamentally a political matter, not a legal matter.
Yeah, thank you. For the sake of time, I think the third question actually is ask how effective is brawling in terms of scoring legislative victory? Do brawlers usually get what they want?
In terms of legislative victories, usually not. There are cases in which brawlers actually do succeed in stopping something and getting what they want, but usually not. That was one of my first, when we started studying this, I wanted to study it as a parliamentary tactic that minorities use to improve their negotiating position. And again and again and again, legislators told me that is not what happens. Once you start brawling, all negotiations stops. It's time to vote and you're going to lose. There are cases in which brawlers win, but that they are very rare. So usually as a legislative tactic, this is a failure.
Okay, thank you. Can I call on Carrie's Templeton? to talk about the question you raised around, especially during Ma's era. Or shall I summarize for you? I don't know. The question is about Taiwan in terms of these kinds of legislative context. Carrie's understanding is that during the Ma era, the DPP occupied the legislature podium because they thought the KMT was divided over government legislation and not organized enough. So this is how around all kinds of cross-trade services in trade agreement and a lot of these kinds of procedure and lots of these kinds of way. So this is a question try to put in terms of the context, in terms of how KMT actually in these kinds of procedure and all kinds of issues. So what would be the logic that you detect right now in the book?
Yeah, when we started studying this, it was in the aftermath of the Ma era, and there were lots of cases in which the KMT majority failed because they were divided internally. And I thought that that was going to be one of the keys to understanding parliamentary brawls. In fact, that turns out to be quite unusual. We almost never see that nowadays, where you have a divided party, a divided majority failing to defend its position against a united minority. That happened quite a bit under Ma, not just in the cross-strait, actually not in the cross-strait services. The cross-strait services agreement would have passed if it hadn't been for the students. It was American beef was the one that was really divided KMT versus a unified DPP, and the DPP stopped it. But I think those are exceptions to the rule, not necessarily a very common arrangement.
Yeah, Carrie suggests that there's certain kinds of consequence that KMT as because of these kinds of brawling, the delayed consideration of the agreement and led to major concession. And this is require more kind of longer and cautious kind of review. And this is also line by line vote. So this is in all kinds of way, kinds of having that kinds of rational kinds of consequences in some way.
Yeah, and that's not the only case in which brawling has produced some kind of positive outcome, some substantive outcome for the brawlers. If you remember the forward-looking infrastructure package, that was originally supposed to be an 8-year package, and they agreed to reduce it to a 4-year package. So there are some times when brawling leads to concessions or negotiations, but usually once you go up on the podium and occupy the podium, then the majority will just push through what it wants. Usually that's what happens.
I think we might, we only have 2 minutes left, but we still have 3 questions. Probably we can extend the time a little bit. So Jason asked the question, does the election cycle affects how often the brawlers tend to use these kinds of strategy to gain their constitution's support? And do they brawl more often at the beginning of their elected session to make names for themselves and try to stay relevant or they will be brawl more at the end of the session to gain support for their next election at the beginning or at the end?
Yeah, We looked at that. We did not write because we did not have a very, very solid result. But we almost, it was right on the edge of significance. The answer is that brawling is much more common in the first or second year of a term, and much, much less common in the last year of a term. Theoretically, that would make sense because you want to communicate your type to your strong party loyalists, and they're paying attention more generally, and average voters pay attention mostly right before the election. You don't want them to pay attention to brawling because they don't like it, so you don't brawl right when they're paying attention. Theoretically, that makes sense. Empirically, it's almost strong enough to present, but I did not think it was quite powerful enough to take that result and put it into to put it front and center as a result.
Okay. And then Mr. Ben Reed asked, how do brawlers themselves talk about their actions, or to what extent do brawlers even admit to researchers like you about their motivations and why they are using these kinds of brawl as certain kinds of strategy?
Well, brawlers always talk about how important it is. You know, democracy was on the line. We had to do this. We didn't have any choice. We had to show up. If we didn't, the system would have fallen apart. You know, the opposite, the other party was doing things that were completely illegitimate. They always talk about this in the most apocalyptic terms they can think of. And sometimes that's justified. So there was a case in Turkey in which the president was basically trying to make himself a dictator, and democracy really was on the line. Usually it's not so much. There was a brawl a couple of years ago in which the KMT was protesting that the premier wasn't explaining policies enough, and what they were actually stopping was the premier from getting up and explaining his policies, which didn't make any sense at all. You have lots of cases in which brawling happens and it doesn't really need to happen. The issues really aren't that central. Brawlers will talk about their actions to their constituents, and I've been told several times, you need to, the strong supporters want you to show up. They want you to be there. If you're not there, they'll ask why you weren't there. But you also need to have an explanation to other people. What were you doing? Why were you doing it? Give me a reason that you had to do that. So they need both. They need to talk to the strong supporters who want to see them representing their party, and to the regular voters who want an excuse.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think we have 3 more questions. I think just to round up, there is one on brawlers all from the minority party.
The minority party is more likely to start brawls, but once you get involved in a brawl, you involve both parties. You do see majority parties do things like what we saw with Sun Boyang. The KMT preemptively went up and occupied the podium to prevent the DPP from doing that and stopping them from passing legislation. So minority party members are more likely to be involved in brawls. It's more complicated for majority party members because the minority party needs to send a signal that we are actively trying to stop this terrible thing from passing. The majority party, they have other priorities. They want to pass legislation, and if you throw the legislature into chaos, you might be preventing legislation from getting passed. So it's a more complicated signal for majority party legislators. There's more danger for them. And so minority party members are more likely to actively want to jump into the fray.
Exactly, yeah. And then I think the last question, the other one actually is a comment. The other question raised by William is around, I heard the brawling in Taiwan has been associated with politicians with criminal connections in Taiwanese legislature. Do you think that the evidence support the association, or if so, why?
The answer is that there are legislators who have criminal associations who have been involved in brawls, but everybody's been involved in brawls, all kinds of people. It's not just them. There are cases in which Luo Fuzhu, who is the criminal of criminals, was involved in brawls. But people tended to assume more often that it was the ideological extremists who would be involved in brawls. It would be the people who really wanted unification or really wanted independence who would be leading the brawls. That's also not true. It's everyone, all kinds of ideologies, all kinds of backgrounds. We could not find a clear correlation of gangsters or ideological extremists. It's junior people who need to establish a reputation. That was the clearest thing we could find.
Yeah. Okay, I think the last two raised by Frank actually more like comments. He suggests that Zhu Gaozhen probably he has a very different ideas about your case around Zhu Gaozhen, and the other comment he makes is around Taiwan is a special case, may not be easily generalized. So that's because there are all kinds of language and race and government structure problems. So more or less,
every case is a special case.
Yeah.
But the brawling in Taiwan doesn't look that much different from what you saw in Japan or South Korea. The early brawls, which were mostly about democracy, you see that all the time in other countries as well. Like I said, Turkey is always fighting about the democratic system. And Ukraine has had quite a few about the democratic system. We've documented a case in I think it was Guyana, which was about trying to preserve democracy. So Taiwan every country is unique, but I don't think that Taiwan's brawling is so unique that you can't put it into comparative perspective.
Sure, I think time is up. Please join me in thanking Nathan. This is just wonderful public talk about brawling in Taiwan, especially. It's especially about the message that we are getting from these kinds of action. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed giving this talk.
So we should end here. Thank you again. And thanks everybody for participating in this lecture.